On a quiet Sunday morning in Pennsylvania, Elias Monroe pushed open the worn wooden doors of a small country church. He didn't come here for the sermon. He came because he had run out of places to search. The cold air clung to his coat as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the congregation with the familiar ache of a man who had been looking for someone most of his life. The faint smell of candle wax and polished pews filled the space. But then, before his mind could wander, the choir began to sing. Two male voices rose above the rest, weaving together in perfect harmony. The sound struck Elias like a blow. It wasn't just the music, it was the melody. A soft, lilting tune, the kind you hum before falling asleep. He knew it because he had once sung it himself, lying beside his twin brother Gabriel under a blanket fort in their shared bedroom. In that moment, the years between then and now collapsed. It was as if he was back in '95 when they were only children and the world had not yet ripped them apart. He could see it as clearly as the stained glass before him the last day they were together. Elias had been caught holding the hand of another boy at school. The whispers reached their grandmother before he even returned home. By nightfall, a decision had been made. Gabriel, the quieter one, would be placed with a well-to-do family who could offer a proper upbringing. Elias would be sent to a boarding school that called itself a reform academy. They told him it would fix him. In truth, it was a place that drained the money from a child until all that was left was survival. Gabriel had tried to be brave. He'd pressed a folded square of purple cloth into Elias's hand, a little scarf their mother once wore, and promised he'd never forget him. Elias kept that scarf through every move, every winter, every failed lead that ended in disappointment. For 3 decades, it lived in the inside pocket of his coat, the only proof he had that his twin existed. Now, sitting in the last pew, he could hear that same boy's voice, older, deeper, but still wrapped in the same warmth. The second voice was just as strong, blending in a way that made it impossible to separate one from the other. Elias's chest tightened. Could Gabriel be here, singing just a few steps away? After 30 years of silence, the thought shook him to his core. He had walked into countless churches over the years, guided only by rumors and half-forgotten tips from strangers. Each time he hoped, each time he left with nothing. But this was different. The harmony was too exact, the phrasing too familiar. It was the sound of shared childhood, the kind that could not be faked. As the hymn swelled, his pulse quickened. He gripped the edge of the pew, trying to steady himself. The years had taught him to temper hope, but right now hope felt unavoidable, as if it had forced its way back into his life, whether he wanted it or not. He didn't know how the next minutes would unfold. All he knew was that the voice he had searched for across decades might be standing right in front of him. He could not leave without finding out. If you've ever carried the weight of a search that seems endless, you know the way it reshapes you, how it makes the smallest details like a scar, a laugh, or a song feel like they could change everything. That morning, Elias understood that sometimes life brings you back to the moment you have been chasing, not in the way you imagined, but in the only way it could happen. And just a few minutes later, he would be standing face to face with the person he had been searching for his entire life. Stay with Heart Stories for the rest of this journey, because the truth that waited beyond that hymn would shatter the life Elias thought he knew. Sometimes, the past isn't just a memory, it's a voice calling you home. The hymn faded, but the sound lingered in Elias Monroe's mind as if it had been stitched into his memory. And with that sound came the ache of the years he could never reclaim. He had learned early that some wounds do not bleed, yet they hollow you out just the same. His began on a day when the world around him decided that who he was could not be accepted. When their mother died, Elias and Gabriel were only boys. Their father, a truck driver, spent long weeks on the road, sending letters and small gifts, but unable to be there. The one constant was their grandmother, a stern woman with iron gray hair and a Bible always within reach. She held legal guardianship over them, which meant she had the power to decide their fate. She claimed she wanted the best for both, but her definition of best was as rigid as the lines in her face. It was the summer of 1995 when she separated them. Elias was labeled the difficult one, too outspoken, too curious, too different. The truth, whispered behind closed doors, was that she had caught wind of him holding another boy's hand. In her mind, this was a shameful defect to be corrected. Gabriel, quieter and more cautious, was considered worth saving. The Montgomery family, wealthy and well-respected in town, promised her that Gabriel would have every opportunity of fine education, travel, safety. She never admitted they paid her for the privilege, but the truth would surface much later. Elias was driven to a boarding institution far from home, a place wrapped in polite words like reform and character building. Behind the gates, there were no warm promises. There were cold dormitories, harsh rules, and the constant reminder that his identity was something to be erased. Letters were intercepted, phone calls were forbidden, birthdays passed unmarked. Gabriel became a ghost, his presence replaced by silence and the memory of a purple scarf. Years later, when Elias finally aged out of the institution, he began searching. He started with public records, knocking on church doors, paging through old-school yearbooks. Whenever a lead emerged, it was quickly blocked. A pastor would suddenly claim the records were private. A neighbor who once knew the Montgomerys would refuse to speak. It took him years to realize that someone had been working to ensure he never found his brother. Rumors followed him into every small town, claims that he was dangerous, unstable, not to be trusted. He never discovered exactly who planted them, only that they shut every door before he could knock. And yet, despite it all, he kept looking, every Sunday he could spare. He slipped into different churches across rural Pennsylvania. Knowing Gabriel had once loved to sing, it became a ritual, half faith, half stubbornness. Now, in this modest church with sunlight spilling through stained glass, he saw them, the two men who had led the hymn. Both had hair streaked with silver, the kind that comes from time rather than neglect. One stood tall with a certain calm authority, the other with a lighter stance, a slight tilt of the head that seemed to invite the world in. It was the second man who caught his breath. The dimples that appeared when he smiled were the exact imprint of Gabriel's childhood face. Elias's heartbeat drummed in his ears. After decades of searching, he had learned not to trust the rush of recognition. But there was something in the way this man held himself, an echo of another boy who once laughed beside him under summer skies. And standing beside him, the other man watched the congregation with the quiet attentiveness of someone who belonged here. In that moment, Elias understood that finding someone is not just about geography. It is about finding them in the version of themselves they became when you were gone, Pum. And sometimes the life they were given was built on choices you never got to make. What was taken from him as a boy was stolen under the guise of love and protection. It was a lesson carved into the years that not every act done for your own good is truly good. Some are simply the comfortable choice for those with power. And if you live long enough, you learn to question who really benefits from the decisions made in your name. The service moved steadily toward the Holy Communion. Elias Monroe remained in his seat until the moment came for the congregation to step forward in a slow, deliberate line. The air was hushed except for the creak of wooden pews and the soft shuffle of feet along the aisle. He rose, his palms damp, his body moving before his mind could fully catch up. The two men who had led the hymn stood on either side of the priest, offering the bread and wine. As Elias drew closer, every detail sharpened. The taller man on the left reached out with a practiced gentleness, his sleeve pulling back just enough for Elias to see the faint scar at his temple, a thin, pale line he knew by heart. Gabriel had gotten it in a fall when they were boys, tripping over a tree root in the backyard. Elias had been the one to run for help, pressing a handkerchief against the wound while their grandmother shouted instructions from the porch. His gaze shifted to the man on the right. The skin on his hand bore a small crescent-shaped mole, perfectly placed near the thumb. That mark had been the subject of teasing between them as children. Elias claiming it looked like the moon, Gabriel insisting it was a warrior's mark. Here it was again, unchanged by decades, a living thread from the past to the present. Elias accepted the bread, but instead of moving on, he whispered Gabriel's name soft enough for only the two men to hear. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then both froze, their hands still, their eyes locking on his face. A shadow of recognition flickered, as if they were weighing something impossible. Without a word, the man with the scar gestured toward the side door. Outside, in the cool air near the church's stone wall, they faced him. There was no small talk, no cautious prelude. The man with the mole spoke first, his voice careful but steady. They admitted they had known for years that they were adopted, told from a young age that their birth parents had abandoned them. It was a story repeated so often it became a kind of truth they never questioned until now. Elias listened, the ache in his chest deepening. He told them plainly, "You are everything to me, and I never walked away from you. I searched for you in every way I could." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The weight of those words was carried in the years they had been apart, years when their lives had unfolded in different worlds. The two men exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. The man with the mole, Gabriel, seemed to draw in a slow breath, as if trying to steady himself. He glanced toward the other man, then back to Elias. The truth of blood and shared beginnings starting to push against the life he had been told was his. Elias could see it in his eyes. Recognition was not a single moment, but a slow unlocking. It was the way memories stirred in the back of the mind when confronted with what they could no longer deny. In that quiet space, Elias realized something he had never let himself consider before. Reunions are not only about joy, they are also about confronting the walls built inside someone else's life. Sometimes those walls were raised to protect, sometimes to control, and sometimes because tearing them down meant facing pain long buried. And in that space between recognition and acceptance, patience becomes more important than certainty. Because finding someone is only the first step. Helping them believe they were never lost is what takes time. The days after that Sunday passed in a blur of restless thought. Gabriel had agreed to meet again, but on the condition that someone else be present, a man named Nathaniel, the same one who had stood beside him in the choir. Elias didn't question it. When a door cracks open after 30 years, you don't slam it shut with demands. You wait, and you walk through at their pace. They chose a quiet afternoon in the parish office, where the heavy curtains filtered sunlight into soft amber. The parish priest, Father Alden, had arranged for another guest to join them, Howard Richardson, a retired attorney with thinning white hair and a leather briefcase worn from decades of use. Elias hadn't expected a lawyer to be involved, but Father Alden spoke as if this meeting had been long overdue. Dr. Richardson placed the briefcase on the desk, unbuckled the straps, and drew out a thick manila folder. The paper inside had yellowed at the edges, but the words were still sharp enough to wound. He explained that in 1995, the Montgomery family had approached him to handle a private adoption. On paper, it was described as an act of charity for an orphaned boy. In truth, it was a transaction. $50,000 had been exchanged, an amount that, in that year, could have bought a small house in their county. The money had gone directly to their grandmother, with the understanding that Gabriel would be placed permanently with the Montgomerys. The folder held more than contracts. Among the documents was a letter unsigned, but in a handwriting Richardson recognized, spelling out a plan to keep Elias away. False reports of behavioral problems were submitted to schools and community leaders. Local pastors were quietly warned about his unsuitability to be around children. Every bridge was burned before he could step on it. Elias felt the heat rise in his chest as the reality settled. All those years, the locked doors and cold stares hadn't been bad luck. They had been engineered. He looked at Gabriel, searching for any sign of shared outrage, but what he saw instead was a quiet turmoil. It was then Gabriel spoke, his voice low. He admitted that for most of his life, he had been told there was another boy in town who shared his first name, a boy described as troubled and different. Only much later did he understand what different meant. He had known Elias was gay, but fear had kept him from seeking him out. Not fear of Elias, but of what it might reveal about himself. Nathaniel, who had been silent until then, rested a hand on Gabriel's arm. Elias realized what their closeness meant. Nathaniel wasn't just a friend from the choir, he was Gabriel's partner, someone who had shared his life in private for 2 decades. The truth unfolded like another page in the file. Gabriel had lived in the same shadow Elias had, only in a different form, hiding not from his brother, but from a world that might strip away everything he'd built. The room felt suspended in time. Elias saw the man his brother had become successful, respected, yet carrying the same quiet compromises Elias had refused to make. The purple scarf in Elias's pocket seemed heavier than ever. No longer just a relic of loss, but a thread connecting 2 lives shaped by the same prejudice, even if it had taken different forms. And in that moment, it was clear that injustice leaves its mark in more than one way. Sometimes it is the wound that drives you away from those you love. Sometimes it is the fear that keeps you from finding them again. The lesson was painfully simple. Silence may protect you for a while, but it can also keep you from the very things that could heal you. When the truth was finally spoken aloud, the silence that followed felt almost holy. Elias Monroe sat across from Gabriel, the air between them thick with 30 years of absence and a lifetime of words unsaid. His hands trembled not from anger, but from the weight of having found what he had been chasing for so long. "You are the only person I have been searching for my entire life," Elias said, his voice breaking. "And all this time, we were breathing the same air." The words were not an accusation, but a release, I think. He had imagined their reunion countless times, but none of those imagined moments had accounted for the reality that his brother had been close, yet living a life that required its own kind of hiding. Gabriel's eyes filled, not just with sorrow, but with something else: relief. Nathaniel's hand on his arm tightened, a silent message that whatever came next would be faced together. For years, Gabriel had feared that living openly as himself would mean losing his place in the life he'd built. But now, faced with Elias, he understood that the cost of silence was far greater. They did not part that day with vague promises. They made decisions. They would not only claim each other as brothers in public, but also stand beside Gabriel and Nathaniel as they stepped into the open for the first time. There would be no more carefully edited stories, no more half-truths offered to avoid discomfort. If family meant anything, it had to be built on truth. 1 week later, the church that had unknowingly reunited them hosted a different kind of gathering. The pews were filled again, but this time the air was lighter, charged with celebration. At the front stood Elias, Gabriel, and Nathaniel, side by side. The service was part reunion, part vow renewal, except the vows were not just for love, but for living without shadows. Members of the congregation who had known Gabriel for years looked on, some in surprise, others with quiet smiles. When the music began, the choir welcomed Elias among them. The 3 voices, once separated by decades and circumstance, now blended in a way that seemed to erase the years. Every note carried pieces of their journey: the loss, the survival, the courage to stand in full light. Elias felt the purple scarf against his chest and knew it had fulfilled its purpose. It had kept him moving forward until this moment could exist. As the final chord faded, the applause filled the sanctuary, but Elias barely heard it. His gaze was fixed on his brother and the man who loved him. This was not the ending of a search, it was the beginning of a life rebuilt from truth. The years they had lost could never be returned, but the years ahead were theirs to write, free from the lies that once defined them. Sometimes, healing is not about erasing the past, but about standing in it without shame. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is choosing to be seen exactly as you are, even if it means rewriting everything people thought they knew. And as they left the church together, a question hung in the air. One Elias knew others in the pews might be asking themselves, if the person you've been searching for was closer than you ever imagined, would you be ready to face them and the truth about yourself when you finally met? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what you would do. Don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more true, powerful stories that remind us why we can never give up on love, family, and the courage to live honestly.